Hi, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Martin Gillespie, the host of Metabolic Wellbeing Without the BS. On the show today is an incredible gentleman based in the UK, but as soon as he opens his mouth, you will understand that he's got a highly intelligent background because he is from South Africa. Neill Friedman, welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, Martin. Brilliant to be here. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Neill, I want to ask you a very important question, sir. How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling excited to be on your podcast. I'm feeling optimistic on the day ahead of me. Having bright sunshine and blue sky certainly helps with that regard. I had a good session in the gym this morning before we get in, which always sets my day up perfectly. I couldn't imagine getting through a work day without going to the gym first. So I am optimistic about life and looking forward to the next hour or so and the rest of the future.
I want to take you on an energy level that you've just mentioned there, the power of optimism. Why is that important to you?
Wow. I just couldn't imagine going through life the opposite. Imagine pessimism. So for me, I think the definition of those two just off the cuff, a pessimistic approach means that everything from this second forward has to be downhill. An optimistic approach says that everything from this second forward has to be uphill. I couldn't possibly imagine thinking that that although this is a great moment, this is going to be the best part of my day because then what happens afterwards, right? So optimism means that things have to get better for me, for people around me. Why would you not be optimistic?
It's incredible. A lot of people don't put a lot of faith in the power of optimism. And particularly here in the UK, there's that heavy energy, people going, oh, it's too hard. It's too hard to change. It's too hard to take control of your biggest asset, your health. Now, your journey on your health has been incredible. Can you give a little bit of background into what it is that you're doing and why you've changed your trajectory and taken ownership of your health?
All right. So yeah, so we'll probably get into this a bit more detail as we go through the conversation. But where I am in my life right now, I am 58 years old. I am very active playing rugby. I refuse to accept the fact that there's an age limit to playing a full contact sport. So I play rugby week in, week out. I returned to academia, or I entered academia in my 50s and got an undergraduate degree in sports and exercise science, and currently undertaking a PhD, very specifically looking at taking a bioenergetics approach to understanding the effect of glucose on our health. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in a lot more detail going through. But my journey to this point was very different. I was a very sporting youngster. I broke my collarbone in a rugby game when I was 21 years old and took the year off and the next year off and the next year off and uh, promptly put on huge amounts of weight. I then got sucked into the corporate world, into everything being about the accumulation of wealth or the attempt to accumulate wealth and working in businesses. I put on a huge amount of weight. So the turning point for me was in 2005 when I was at my heaviest. I was about 122 kilograms. To give you an idea, I'm now 90 kilograms. So I was hugely overweight. I was diagnosed as being pre-diabetic. And at the same time, we got the unexpected news that my wife was unexpectedly pregnant with our third child. We thought those days were behind us. Strangely enough, the third child in question is actually lying to my left over here on the couch that I'm sitting on. She's now 18. But we yeah so and I came to the realization that if I continue on the health trajectory that I was on, I probably wouldn't be alive by the time my daughter was 10, and certainly I wouldn't be actively part of her life. So that was the starting point for me, and I made a very simple change. Very strange. I made a lot of very good decisions instinctively without realizing it, and only now that I look back I realized I made some good decisions. One of those first good decisions I made was I set myself a process goal rather than an outcome goal. And I'm a big believer in that to help people motivate going forward is to set process goals, not outcome goals, because you don't always have control of the outcome, but you always have control of the process. So the process goal I set myself at that point was to say, I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week, every single week for the next 6 months. That was the process. And I especially set it to 3 times a week, because if I missed one, I could make one back without, still get my 3 in a week. And fortunately, at the time, the gym that I joined happened to be linked to a spa, and I set myself a little reward. I simply said that if on a Friday I'd been to the gym 3 times, as I committed myself, I was going to take myself for a massage on a Friday afternoon. That was my reward. And that was my process. I didn't set an outcome goal. I didn't say I'm going to lose weight. I'm going to get healthier. I'm going to get sportier. I just committed to the process of going to the gym 3 times a week. And 3 times very quickly became 5 times a week. And my health started to change naturally just by doing that. And then as a little bit of weight started falling off, it then became easier to look at the other things that I could do. So that was the start of my journey. Within that period, later 2006, I emigrated, brought the whole family here to the UK. And I continued on my health journey, very personal. I started studying nutrition. I realized that nutrition was a lot more complex than I thought, and I wanted to study it. But again, the sole purpose for that was around my own health. 2013, the company that brought me to this country made me redundant, and I had that brilliant line at that point where my wife turned around to me and said, quite frankly, your friends and family are sick to death of hearing you talking about leptin levels and cortisol levels. You need a wider audience. I know you don't want to go back into the corporate world. Why don't you do something around health? And I started a small little nutrition business here in Northampton as a nutrition advisor. That did okay. It did very badly as a retail business, but I started realizing that I could work with people, and that the knowledge that I had gained wasn't just good for me, but it was good for sharing with other people. That evolved to me doing a little bit of work as a nutritionist to Bedford Blues, the rugby club, the championship rugby club, where I started working with one or two of their players there, and again achieved some decent results. But I got to a point quite quickly where I realized that as a career, I hit the ceiling because all my knowledge was self-taught. And at a certain point, people want to see that you have more of a formal education. At that point, I just turned 50, and I didn't think you could go back to university at 50. But a bit of motivational advice that I picked up from one of these online gurus that I've been following. I hate that term guru, but there you go. Made me realize that at 50, I had as much of my life in front of me as what I had behind me. And I bit the bullet, took the big financial knock, took my family on a bit of a financial journey with me to walk away from most sources of incomes and get myself a degree. And when I started the undergrad degree, it was always on the basis that I was going to go on to doing a PhD, a postgrad. But I didn't realize, and I knew it would be around nutrition, but my knowledge at that point around bioenergetics was very limited. As I evolved, I became what I now term myself a bioenergeticist. I believe that our mitochondria are the key to everything, and that there's good evolutionary reasons for that. And I'm hoping we'll discuss it as we go through. And that's brought me on my journey now to where I am. So as I say, that kind of brings us up to date. As I say, I consider myself metabolically healthy. I consider myself, in really good shape. I could always be in better shape. I haven't got it perfect. But I'm busy realizing that a lot of my journey can be shared with others. But I also believe that there is something horrifically wrong with our environment, the world around us, in terms of health, and that there is a need for a paradigm shift. And I want to be part of that paradigm shift. I don't want to say I'm going to change the world, but in the evolution of science and in the evolution of policy and in the evolution of thinking, nobody makes one big difference. It's a whole bunch of little cogs that all collectively start to turn in the same direction. And I'm hoping that through my research and through my work, I can become one of those little cogs that does that. And I'm also hoping through the foundation that we'll hopefully we'll talk about later, I can then channel financing into other students and other researchers so that they can become part of the collective, part of the cog. And I just want to sort of end this little segment. I'll say that what I'm talking about by a paradigm shift is very, very important. And I'm going to quote a Dr. Robert Naveau, whose work I quite enjoy. And basically, Dr. Naveau has said that he's come up with this great little expression. He says the whole um, paradigm of medical research that got us to where we are today is an understanding of what leads to pathology, what takes us and makes us sick. The new paradigm shift has to be what is the path that leads to good health. So now we understand what makes us sick. We need to understand what makes us healthy, because just reversing the pathway that makes us sick doesn't necessarily make us healthy. All right. And so that's where I think the new paradigm is. We need to start moving medical research and our understanding away from understanding pathology to understanding what it is to be healthy.
I don't know where to start here, but I want to drill down into a key part that you're the young, tender age of 58, right? And at the age of 50, you had that vision to go, I'm not done yet. And here we are, two blokes talking about this. And I want to drive a kind of men's health agenda here a little bit here, Neill, if you don't mind. We as men sometimes think, oh, it's all I know. I'm not going to take that risk. I've got a mortgage. I've got kids' school fees. I've got all these material things to pay for. And we kind of lose ourselves a little bit. But thanks to the love of your partner to sort of go, I'll support you because this is important. How much of a value is that for men to sort of go, take responsibility for your health and start growing your brain, your knowledge, your mindset, because you've got a life ahead of you, not just a life behind you?
I think that's critical, and it saddens me a little bit that most men, including myself, come to it quite late. Quite weird. I realized I was listening to some of your back podcasts, just to kind of get a feel for some of your previous guests, and I noticed a bit of a theme through there, which was many people sort of went through the path of bad health and then had something that drove an epiphany, whether they got sick or whether they suddenly had mental health issues. But it almost seems like we all need to reach kind of like a rock bottom point from a health perspective in order to have the light switch on and turn us around. And what I would love to see as part of the future is getting rid of the need for that first part. Why don't we just have lifestyles that drive towards this right from the beginning? Why do we need to go down the wrong route before we go down the right route? And I think that's where we need to change, and we need to accept the way all people, but specifically men, start to switch onto the idea early before they have that rock bottom moment, because not everybody has the moment where they can turn. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing a lot of, and I'm going to touch on probably some cultural things here that might upset a few people. I'm sorry if I do, but we're seeing the demasculinization of men at the moment. All right, we're seeing that testosterone-based behavior is being seen as the problem with the world, and we're taking kids today, and we're making. I don't want to use the word soft because that's not the right term, but we're making boys almost embarrassed to grow up to be men. And I think that is the pathway to huge amounts of mental health issues as we get older. So that is not to say that I think we all need to be misogynistic, you know, alpha males who need to stamp our testosterone fuel, thing on. That's not what it is. That's not what I'm talking about. But you know, I, I heard someone make a comment the other day, and it fits in perfectly. They said every single male has a fantasy about saving somebody or saving the world, rushing into the gunfight and getting rid of the bad guy and bringing down the terrorists. That every male has this fantasy. At some point, he's gonna become a hero. He's gonna be a real life hero about doing something, right? Um, and that's our natural male process. That's almost our protective thing. So where we have the nurturing process within females because of bringing up children, that's our nurturing process. That's part of our testosterone way that we think we can use our natural male side of things to be protective and to be, to offer that sort of that level of things. And I think we're trying to knock that out of kids today, young boys. And I think to do that is to deny what it is to be male. And I think there's risks to that. And I think that is a cause of cognitive dissonance. And I think that's a cause of a lot of mental health challenges with kids today coming through, boys today coming through puberty into being young men.
I think, you mentioned so many areas there. I think a key aspect is in my opinion, is around men to feel comfortable about talking about their emotions. Because it's an area we don't do very well in this, dare I say it, this British cultural camouflage. Don't show emotions. You play rugby, mate, you break your collarbone, it bloody hurts. You break a bone, it hurts. Be able to cry. I came across a brilliant quote the other day, actually, Neill. Regardless of the age, if you cry more, you'll pee less.
Okay.
So you can cry with joy, but you can cry with sorrow. And I think that men in particular, until they hit that kind of midlife, if that makes sense, they don't express their emotions through those teenage 20 years. And then they camouflage it with poor food choices, alcohol abuse, and even drug abuse, and, dare I say it, addictive relationship trauma.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I weirdly, sort of a full disclosure here, I'm probably one of those men that you're describing. So you talk about English culture being stoic. Try being a South African male. All right. So basically, emotions are not something you bring up in any way. And that's something I've got to be honest. I still battle with. I am not a natural talker when it comes to talking about emotional. I I deal with a lot of my emotional stuff by having these really, really in-depth conversations inside my own head. I have a lot of I win 90% of the arguments I have with my wife, but it's only the ones that I had in my own head where I'm being her voice as well. All right, not the ones that we have out loud, because I have most of most of these discussions I internalize, and I kind of feel like I do. So I'm really, really bad at that. On the other hand, I cry in movies. My family laugh. I mean, I cry at stupid things watching the television. All right. So, my wife will turn around to me sometimes and say, something like, I didn't see you cry when your mom died. Okay. And Alzheimer's is what got her. And I've listened to some of your guests on that subject. Yet you're crying on the television because somebody on the NCIS episode that you've been watching has said something emotional. And she says, how do you square those two things up? You know what I mean? I don't see you expressing much real emotion for your own life or for reality, but you'll cry. So maybe that's where maybe it's when I'm watching the television that I allow the emotions to come to the surface. But whilst I agree with you that it's important, that is one of my personal challenges still that lie in front of me in terms of discussing. I'm not good at discussing my own feelings and thoughts. I resort quite a lot to the science. I'm very, very good at doing that, and that's probably why I'm studying the way that I'm doing. I try to look for this scientific explanation around things to understand them rather than the emotional connection.
I think that, I hear you. And from my personal experience, it took a while to break through some of those emotional traits that you've had for many, many years and the societal expectations. But I want to drive another key area, which I think is really important. You mentioned that you worked in the corporate environment, and that's something we both have in common. Taking the topic of the toxicity and corporates, it can be a very unhealthy marriage if you're in the wrong corporate organization that superficially would say, we value our staff, but they drive a lot of toxic behaviors behind the scenes. Do you have any experience in your personal and also the people that you've worked with and seeing it from a different light now, that why that can have a massive impact on your metabolic well-being?
I think that has the hugest aspect in your metabolic well-being on two levels. The one level is when you talk about corporate toxicity. One level is just the actual nature of the corporate in terms of what we would, I suppose, typically define as being a toxic environment where everyone's trying to get above everybody else, and that, again, I think there's a lot of lip service given to emotional staff. So the corporate that I worked for in the end, despite everything that they did around promoting health and well-being, they had a redundancy, the global corporate, they had a redundancy cycle. So every single year, around about the same time, it was about November every year, huge chunks of staff got made redundant. All right. They went through all the tick boxes to do it all in the legal ways, but basically they just kind of got rid of what they pretty much would have thought of as dead wood, I suppose, every year, which meant, and I eventually in 2013 fell victim to that. But it did mean that the entire time that you're there, everything that you think is important in your life, because when you're in that corporate world, you believe that succeeding and getting, advancing through the steps and doing well and making money and all of these things is the be all and end all. But at the same time, you've constantly got this thing over your head that any November now, it might be your chance to be on the cutting block and then you're gone. I mean, just think about the long-term stress that that's doing to you. Everything that you're doing is just to be, you're working as hard as you can in this toxic environment to try to make sure that you stay in the toxic environment. What's the irony in that? All right. You're trying to make sure you don't get redundant. So you're working in the toxic environment to make sure you stay within the environment. But then there's the other side of the toxic environment, which is just the physical side. So I traveled a lot, which meant that I had to eat on the side of the road most of the time. You try and get a healthy meal at any services up and down the country. It's just really, it's junk food, and that's what it's there for. Or I'm eating in hotels. And again, you try to get a healthy meal in your average corporate type hotel rather than, a high end. We weren't staying at the Hilton, put it that way. And then even within the workspace, you're not eating properly, and then you constantly involved in things like in the corporate world. There's these, I'm going to call it the social side, but it's the work function side. So a high alcohol environment in the evening, the awards dinners, and all of these things, and again, really bad food options. All right. So I mean, even now with university, I mean, I attend research conferences on quite a scale. And every research conference, the food that gets brought out at lunchtime is just pre-made sandwiches, right? And crisps. It's just high carb, junk carb options. That's what's there. That's your choice. And then a bit of fruit at the end, some token fruit before the cheese and wine comes out. So there's that. There's the toxicity of the environment in terms of the working place, but there's also just the physical toxic lifestyle that you need to do. And so when I was going through my changes, I mean, it was really, really difficult. I mean, yes, we have all these great ideas. Prep all your food on a Sunday and make sure you take your pre-made meals to work with you, which is brilliant if you've got all Sunday to prep your food, yeah. And freeze it, and you've got to have the freezer space. You've got to have all of these things as well. So, and then has the work environment got the microwave to warm it up with it? It's not just as easy as the bro scientists would say. Prep all your meals on a Sunday and you're good for the week. Um, so you got these two challenges that sort of compound each other. You've got your primary choice is to eat junk food, and then you've got the high stress, emotionally toxic place to be in. So yeah, corporates aren't ideal, and then tie that all in with with the what's the word, the virtue signaling and the we care about our staff, and they make them redundant every year.
You mentioned, and I think you mentioned it earlier on, the impact of stress. Now, I know we spoke earlier about the reframing potentially of stress, and that's something that you're quite passionate about. What are your views on the word stress and then a reframe of the word resilience?
Okay, so let's talk about stress. So one of the things that we chat about a little bit off air before we started was the concept that we only have physiologically two signaling pathways in our body. We have our sympathetic nervous system, which is our up system, the fight or flight system, and we have the parasympathetic, which is the dialing down, the calming down of the system. So we can relate that specifically to my research to being the inflammatory pathway and the anti-inflammatory pathway, parasympathetic. And these things are very tied to metabolism because they're fueled differently. They're fueled differently in terms of substrates, which leads into metabolic flexibility, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point. So we only have these two systems, but we have thousands or hundreds of thousands of nuanced responses to these two systems. And those nuanced responses are taught to us and they come from our own experience. And I did mention to you earlier, one of the great sources for reading for this, for anybody who's interested, is the book by Lisa Feldman Barrett, How Emotions Are Made. So I could highly recommend her work. And she's had a few TED Talks and YouTube talks as well. But let me give you a great example of how we can interpret these two signals in different ways. I can't remember what episode it was, but one of the very early series of an American talent show, I don't know if it was America's Got Talent or whatever, an early iteration of Idols or whatever it was in America, was won by a young 9-year-old girl. She was a singer. And she built up this reputation throughout the competition. She won that she just didn't seem to display any nerves. She would go on stage in front of these big audiences and massive television audience and just be confident and perform. And there was an interview done with her about 5 years ago. She was a 19, 20-year-old now. And they asked this question, and they asked her, how come you weren't or didn't appear to be nervous before you went on stage? And she explained that she grew up with her father being a lay minister in a church, and her mother headed up the gospel choir. And she, from a very young age, fronted that gospel choir and sang. And when the first time she experienced sort of butterflies in her stomach, and she tried to explain it to her mother, her parents' interpretation of that was that sensation was God coming into her to give her the strength to sing. So she naturally always interpreted the sympathetic nervous system response, which we can associate with the feeling of butterflies in our stomach and excited energy. She always interpreted that as being given theological strength, God coming into her. She was never taught that was negative. She was never taught that was nerves. In fact, she grew up thinking if she was ever about to sing and she never got that feeling in her stomach beforehand, then she'd be afraid, because then she'd feel like God had abandoned her. So what 99% of us experience before we do a public speaking engagement, she interpreted as God coming into her. It's the same physiological response, the exact same thing happening inside her, but the interpretation is completely different. And that is what I think is our key relationship with the stress, the up part or down part, is that we only have these two systems. And how we interpret them is based on our years of experience. If we've constantly been given a negative interpretation, that's how we will experience that. We can train it away, by the way. She does talk about it's not easy for some people, depends on how long you've had that. And the same is the down system, is the depressive side. Anxiety and depression, people always categorize as one illness, but they're actually the same illness but opposite extremes. Anxiety is sympathetic nervous system. Depression is it's parasympathetic nervous system. So it's, one wants to get up and, fight or flight, and the other one wants you to just sit down and stare at the couch and do nothing. And there's a good biological reason that I believe we have that depression. I'll digress very slightly towards a bit of some of my PhD research. So if you think about cavemen, right? So our predecessors, they didn't have, medications and things. If they got sick, if somebody got a virus, they picked up a pathogen in that environment, the only way to stop that pathogen spreading through the tribe would be for that person to isolate himself away from the tribe. So there is a possibility that our evolutionary process, our natural selection, has taught us that when we get sick, when we're feeling down, when we got a virus, that we want to then withdraw from our tribe as a natural means to protect the tribe. And then back in those caveman days, one of two things would happen. Either you would succumb to the pathogen and you would die, all right, and you would do so in isolation, or you would naturally get better. And when you got better, you would then feel energized again and you would rejoin your tribe. Now, in our environments today, where we are potentially chronically inflamed as a result of our diets, of our lifestyles, of the air that we breathe, and all the things that's happening around us, we are potentially in a position where our body is continuously interpreting the fact that we need to self-isolate. But because it's chronic, because we're constantly in that state, that becomes permanent depression, because depression is just the desire to isolate. So it could well be that this neurological disorder that we call depression is actually a mitochondrial response to not being well, as an idea to make us self-isolate in order to protect the tribe. You know, basically, long before Boris Johnson stood up on the TV screen and told us we all to go into lockdown, we have a natural process that says, you know, if you've got a virus, try to self-isolate so you don't spread it. We have a natural, you know, way of doing that. So yeah, so I don't know if that quite answers your question about stress, but
no,
yeah,
I think it's funny you say that, because the phrase, if you're not feeling that well during the day, and we all have highs and lows, again, one of the key pillars of metabolic well-being is the power of a good sleep. But if we've been chronically inflamed, and when we talk about chronic inflammation, I'm going to take the aspect of the negative, of the energy that we have outside, the negative energy that's there, media broadcasts, all these noises in our heads. But if we have a good night's sleep, an amazing tool, how does it make one feel?
So, you know, I think there's still big science trying to be done as to exactly what it is that we get out of sleep. We know that it makes us healthy, and we know that we have to have it. But science is still a little bit out there as to why. But I definitely think it's an energy cleansing, if you want. I'm always worried about expressions like that. But I've become quite good at, when you know, you don't always remember your dreams, but I've become quite good at being able to, when I wake up, or and I do recall a dream, and it might be quite outlandish and weird, as dreams, you know, very often are. But I've become quite good at being able to try to look back at that dream and what happened the day before or in the weeks beforehand that dream was tackling on. And sometimes, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but sometimes the links are quite, you know, quite dubious. But I kind of see a link, and I just think it's processing. I think we need to process everything, and I think the time to process what's already gone in is when we're not taking anything more in. So that's sleep time, isn't it? So we shut off most of our senses when we're sleeping. We close our eyes. We try to shut out noise. You know, so we're almost going into a slightly sensory deprived state, which is the great opportunity then for the brain to clean itself out. I mean, I'm going to make a weird analogy now, but I think it makes sense. You know how many people, when when your stomach rumbles, you get a rumbling in your stomach, and people go, "Oh, your stomach's rumbling because I'm hungry," right? Stomach rumbling isn't because you're hungry. Stomach rumbling, that actual noise, I can't remember, there's a wonderful scientific name for it, and I can't think of what it is right now. But that stomach rumbling is basically your intestines going through a clean out, right? So basically, your intestines are just doing a complete clean. Now, if you think about it, the logical time to clean anything is when it's empty, right? So when things are full of clutter, like, you can't really get to clean. You can't clean a room like the one around me when it's full of clutter. So although the grumbling isn't because we're hungry, it's easy to interpret it that because it generally means that your colon is doing this clean while there's no food in it. So yeah, you could actually be hungry because that happens to be a good time. All right. This is the same thing with what we're talking about now with sleep. So it's a good time for your brain, for your synapses and your stuff to potentially do a purge, do a clean out while there's no fresh information coming in. It's that's right, and that's an opinion, by the way. There's no scientific evidence from that. That's my opinion on that. I just think that, and that's why I think sleep is important. But also, we also know that a lot of recovery takes place during sleep, right? So if you're a gym rat, and we know with the gyms, everything's about, it's the same pathways. I love to talk about fractals. It's the same pathway. Pro-inflammatory, it's anti-inflammatory. You go into the gym and you go through what they call MBS, right? Muscle protein, MPS, muscle protein breakdown, MPB, sorry, in the gym. In the gym, MPB, muscle protein breakdown, right? We break that, we put micro tears into our muscles. Over the next 24 hours, we go through a cycle called MPS, which is muscle protein synthesis. That's where the muscle gets repaired, and it repairs the micro tears, and it makes them slightly bigger and slightly stronger. But we also know that the vast majority of MPS takes place when we sleep, right? So most of us build muscle while we sleep. If we break down the muscle in the gym in the day, the actual repair happens overnight, because that's the opportunity to do that. And again, I think this relates to how our synapses work and the way our neurons work. And again, this is not my sort of field, so it's my opinion. So I think repair process. So yeah, the stresses of the day.
I want to bring another key area, because I think that another massive area that is undervalued is the power of our breathing. When you talk about mitochondria, and for those, just to put it into simplicity ways, mitochondria, your energy cells in your whole body, is probably the easiest layman's term to use here. But when we learn to breathe properly, we'll learn to actually be in that present moment more. How much, in your opinion, from the corporate executive that you were to where you are now, and there are pressures in doing what you're doing in your research and your PhD, there are, you mentioned that you're very process driven, so you're very, these are the goals that you want to achieve. But in your experience, how much has your personal breathing technique subconsciously changed over the last 10 years?
I can go into a lot of depth in that, but let me start by giving a very, very simple thing. I was asthmatic as a child. I grew up on Ventolin and Beritic asthma sprays. Although I was very sporty, I always had an asthma pump close by to me. In my teen years, I ended up in hospital twice with what they call a spontaneous pneumothorax, which effectively means my lungs collapsed and the air escaped from the alveoli into my tissues around my neck, etc. I never envisaged a life where where asthma didn't exist. I haven't carried an asthma pump on me for 20 years now. I haven't had anything that even resembles an asthma attack for probably 25 years. I have absolutely no symptoms of asthma whatsoever. To be fair, I don't even really remember what an asthma attack looks like. Now, it was never one of my goals to cure myself of asthma, but I did. By changing my lifestyle, by losing weight, by being healthy, by changing the way I eat, by being conscious of my breathing. And again, there's a lot of good reasons why people go to the gym, and building muscle, especially when you get to our age and sarcopenia starts to become a thing, and you need to try to slow down that part of the cycle. But one of the things, if you go to the gym and you lift weights properly, one of the things you have to learn to do, especially if you want to lift heavy weights, is your breathing, right? So you breathe in as you're bringing the bar down, as you're taking the strain, and when you're pushing out, you breathe out to get the extra force. So you start to get that whole cyclic pattern of breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth within the pattern of whatever you're doing in the gym. Even if you're doing aerobic stuff, so you're on the treadmill and you're running, whatever it is, that's all being fueled oxidatively when you're being aerobic. That's oxygen based, right? So a great way of naturally developing your breathing pattern, for me anyway, was by being in the gym and just being conscious of how I'm breathing through my movements. All right. And that does all come back to the mitochondria. So let's, if you don't mind, just go on a little bit of segue, because obviously I believe everything comes back to the mitochondria, and it might just be worth me explaining why I believe that, and talking a little bit about evolutionary science. And it's important to state that with evolutionary science, we have lots of theories. We don't have any 100% facts, and short of jumping into a DeLorean and traveling back billions of years, we'll never ever have, there'll always be theories, right? So, but the nature of knowledge is that it's not permanent, right? So knowledge is always evolving. So there are a couple of theories about evolution, but a few things that are quite well stated facts. So the thing that drives, well, let me start off at a little bit beginning. So just kind of picture a little bit, just take your listeners on a mental journey here. Picture the Earth about 4.5 billion years ago, right? So we've got an atmosphere that's made up mostly of methane. There's no oxygen. There's no land mass, just a very acidic sea. And underneath the sea, and I'll try and keep this quite short, you've got these outcrops of a mineral called serpentine, which is as a result of all the alkaline activity coming out from the crust of the Earth and interacting with the very acidic ocean. And on this mineral, on the serpentine, this conflict between the acidic environment and the base environment, the high pH and the low pH, is causing positively charged particles to move across this rock face. As it does that, over billions of years, we're talking about, about 2.5, 3 billion years, this starts to form a lipid barrier. A fat layer gets formed on this rock. And that fat barrier basically turns out and forms a bubble, a fat bubble. And the proton pumping that was taking place across the rock now takes place across this lipid barrier. It's now taking place across this the outside and inside of this fat bubble. And that's the start of life. That's the first organic substance in the world, because now that proton pumping is not tied to the rock. It's now free to float across the ocean. And it can go looking for sources of energy. It can go towards the surface and try to harness some of the energy within the sunlight. All right. So we get these single-celled creatures that form, and they're being driven by proton pumping. Over time, we get the formation of a eukaryotic cell. Again, I can bore you to tears with how it happened or how we think it happened. But effectively, a eukaryotic cell is now a cell on the outside with little bacteria on the inside. And those bacteria do the same proton pumping. Nothing's changed for over these now 3 billion years. Proton pumping is still going across that bacteria, but that is now providing the energy for the whole cell, not just for the bacteria, but for the outer cell around it. All right. That cell, that eukaryotic cell, is what every single one of us is made of today. We are made up of trillions of eukaryotic cells. That bacteria inside that is pumping protons in and out to derive energy, those are our bacteria. We call those bacteria today. The proton pumping mechanism that drives them hasn't changed in 4.5 billion years. All right, it hasn't changed. There is speculation by scientists that if we were ever to find life on another planet, be that bacterial life or little green men, that for there to be that life, proton pumping would have to be at the heart of it. It's called chemiosmotic theory. All right. So the thing that animates us, so anatomy without energy is lifeless, right? There is no life in flesh without energy. The thing that provides that energy is proton pumping that takes place inside all of our mitochondria, inside all of our cells, providing the energy so we can move, so we can think, so we can be alive. And that process is 4.5 billion years old. And that's why I believe that all of our health issues come down to the behavior of bioenergetics, the behavior of that proton pumping across the inner mitochondrial membrane, inside our mitochondria, inside our cells.
What a brilliant 5-minute overview. And that gives a great segue, Neill, into the work that you're doing now is trailblazing in many ways. Can you explain a little bit about this passion, purpose, and the joy that it's bringing you and the team that you're working with about what it is that you're delivering?
Yes, absolutely. So at the university, I'm part of a group called I'm at the University of Northampton, give a plug to the University of Northampton. I'm part of a group called the Bioenergetics Research Group. And effectively, the Bioenergetics Research Group looks at these mechanisms, these mitochondria that I just discussed, and why we believe that their functionality is core and linked to just about every chronic disease and the negative aspects that we are told to believe is normal, but which I don't believe are normal in terms of aging. All right. And we're all of us within this group, and the group goes back 14, 15 years now as we go through, are all looking at different aspects and different chronic diseases and different lifestyle interventions. So because we believe mitochondria is linked to everything from neurodegenerative diseases, the difficult way in which we believe many women are experiencing menopause today, disruptions potentially to puberty in young people. So, Alzheimer's disease, the type 2 diabetes, metabolic disorders, all of these things, we will all come down to mitochondria. So every one of us looked at a slightly different aspect of it. My aspect that I'm specifically looking at is trying to link things to the immune system, to the pro and anti-inflammatory immune system, so to our macrophages. And I'm looking at one specific toxin because we've got a world of toxins around us. And the specific toxin that I'm personally focused on is glucose. All right. In terms of our chronic exposure to glucose. So it's not just the fact that glucose, it's chronic exposure to glucose. So, and then different aspects. So we've got different people within our group looking at different challenges, so different lifestyle interventions from exercise to air that we breathe, etc. And then they're also looking at that in terms of different outcomes. So how are these things? Everyone's focused on a single outcome and a single challenge, but collectively as a group, it's really exciting because we're bringing all this information together. And it's amazing how we see the same patterns, so the same mitochondrial patterns that affect Alzheimer's and cognitive decline are the same patterns that affect how we respond to COVID, cytokine storm, at the same pattern that we see over and over again, just with different outcomes and differences. So specifically what I'm doing, and I'll get right onto the focus of my particular PhD project, is I am taking yeast cells. So really, really interesting. The yeast are made up of eukaryotic cells. So the same type of cells that we are made up of, yeast are made up of. So the yeast that we use for making bread, the yeast we use for brewing beer are eukaryotic cells, and they behave in ways that are very similar to ours. And the nice thing about working with yeast is they've been studied as a simulation for human cells for so long that we've got so many of the pathways mapped. We know, something called, SNP1 relates to the AMPK pathway in humans. So it's the same process, but so we've mapped the pathways out. So we know what in yeast responds to what happens to us. So basically what I'm doing, I'll go through my project very simply. I am growing yeast up. I'm exposing my yeast for 48 hours to 3 different lifestyle interventions. So one lot of yeast is spending their time in a high glucose environment for 48 hours. The next lot of yeast in a low glucose environment for 48 hours. And my third intervention is to fast them for 48 hours. So they get put into water for 48 hours. So they do a little intermittent fast. I then take my yeast cells and I isolate their mitochondria. So spend time in the lab and we break open the cells and I take out the mitochondria. And then I examine that mitochondria to look at their ability to perform oxygen consumption rates, so how they are able to derive energy from oxygen, breathing, all right. And I also look at their membrane potential. So the electronic charge across that proton pumping membrane that I spoke to earlier, I look to see how that changes, how that membrane potential changes. And then I look to see within all my 3 of my yeast, I look for those changes when I then expose those yeast to a challenge. So I expose the yeast to something called lipopolysaccharides, which puts them under a stress. It's a stress similar to a bacterial infection. And I look to see if the specific markers that I'm looking at make those mitochondria more or less resilient to the challenge. And that's what I'm busy doing. And I'm still collecting data, and I can't tell you whether my hypothesis is supported yet or not. But that's what we're looking at. So I'm specifically looking at how our mitochondria can respond to a challenge depending on how chronically exposed to glucose they have been. And I believe that what's funding me, what's fueling me, and why I think this is important is I think that the chronic 24/7, 12-month a year exposure to glucose or high sugar in our diets predisposes us to having a bad response in terms of inflammation. We stay in a pro-inflammatory space. So just very, very simply for your audience, in terms of people listening, in that in that sympathetic nervous system response, the fight or flight response, the pro-inflammatory response, we fuel that energy through glycolysis, through sugars. All right. The parasympathetic response, the down response, the all's calm and all's well in the world response, that is a parasympathetic response that is fueled by oxidative phosphorylation. That is fueled by oxygen and fats rather than sugars. And that energy is derived from our mitochondria rather than from the glycolytic process that takes place in the cytosol of the cell. So effectively, fight, flight, stress response is sugar fueled. All's calm, all's well. The serotonin response in the world is fueled by breathing, oxygen, and fats in our diet, with a little bit of input from sugar, but sugars that we can manufacture ourselves if necessary. So mitochondria are the part that fuels us in that parasympathetic stage. And the problem that we have at the moment is because we've got so much sugar in our diet, I believe that we are chronically in that pro-inflammatory state because our bodies are trying to detoxify it. Right? So because we don't want glucose circulating in our blood, right? That's being diabetic. We want to be able to eat some sugar, have an insulin response that tells the system to then take as much of that sugar and pack it away, store it away. We turn the glucose into glycogen, and we either store the glycogen in our muscles at this place. We then store whatever's left around our liver to be able to use later through the Cori cycle. And then if there's still circulating glucose, that ultimately then gets turned to fat and gets packed on as the unhealthy fat that sits around our organs. But all of that is to make sure that the glucose isn't circulating in our blood for too long. But if we're chronically exposing ourselves to glucose, the only way our body can get rid of once the glycogen stores in the muscles and the liver are full, and we're busy accumulating fat at an unhealthy rate, the only other way we can get rid of circulating glucose is to turn it into energy. which means we're doing it glycolytically and we're doing it in a pro-inflammatory way. So we're keeping ourselves in a pro-inflammatory state. We have
Wow.
to get the glucose out of our blood to bring it down.
Now, that's your PhD. And just briefly, you're also doing some other amazing work in order to create, I was going to say a legacy, but in order to create another pathway for people to follow in your footsteps from different angles. Can you explain a little bit around that? Because it's brilliant.
So that's what the BERG F is about. I said to you, within the university, we've got the group, which is the Bioenergetics Research Group, which is the BERG, and the BERG F is the foundation that we've set up outside of that. So the origins for setting up the BERG F was when I'm self-funding my PhD. So I'm surrounded by people that have got PhDs that are being funded by all sorts of industries and companies and government bodies, etc. And here I am busy funding my own PhD. And the reason I'm funding my own PhD is because I couldn't get initially funding for my PhD. And what I discovered along the way is that the vast majority of medical research funding is looking at funding a project that can end up by having something that is marketable at the end of it. So whether they're looking at a drug target so you can make drugs, whether they're looking at some sort of a physical product that can be made, the funding comes in for that. But when you're looking to fund research that is going to hopefully advise government policy and which is going to have an economic benefit that is downstream, there's no physical end thing that you're going to sell right now. That research, that funding is very, very difficult to come by. So I identified that when trying to find funding for myself. But at the same time, there's a huge amount now of corporate awareness and corporate requirement. So never be too harsh on the corporates. Corporate requirement to do social impact funding, to be able to invest something. So particularly if you are part of a government procurement process, right? So if you are a supplier to the NHS, doesn't matter whether you're selling beds or food or whatever it is, when you win your contract to supply to the NHS, you actually make a commitment when you win the tender that a certain percentage of the value of that contract you have to spend in social impact funding. All right. If you supply fire engines to the fire department and you win that tender, a certain value of that fund of that project, you have to contribute towards social impact funding. So the idea behind the I tap into that corporate funding to try to get money from corporates to say, right, you have to spend X amount on social impact funding. We would like some of that to come into the BERG F, so we can use that to fund research projects that are bioenergetically orientated because of my belief and our belief that the mitochondria is key to it all. But these are projects that are going to look to be able to evidence exactly how lifestyle changes have health benefits. So we're looking, and then we want to use that knowledge to influence policy and help create an environment which is easier for people to be healthy, which ultimately has an economic benefit, right? So, I mean, I always talk about, everyone with the NHS is always talking about freeing up beds. The NHS is struggling to free up beds. Well, you can only do so much to free up beds when people are getting sick. Surely the best way to free up beds is to stop people from getting sick in the first place so they don't go into the beds, right? Let's have the NHS beds being reserved for idiots like me at 58 to play rugby and then break a bone, right? So they can go in and get fixed, all right? Rather than somebody who's occupying a bed for 3 months in the NHS because of diabetes, which is potentially a lifestyle factor, particularly if we're talking type 2. All right, so how do we so we can relieve a huge amount of that financial burden on the NHS by improving people's health. We have preventative health. But to get the investment into that is very, very difficult. So so that's what the BERG F is about. The BERG F is looking to channel. BERG F is set up as a not-for-profit. So we've set the business is a limited company guarantee set up shared by guarantee. So it's very specific. You can't make a profit. It's not allowed to make a profit. And we are looking for social impact funding that comes into the BERG F that we can then invest in the future science and the future scientists of tomorrow. So the short-term goal of the BERG F is to fund 12 PhD projects over the next 4 years. So produce 12 new PhD researchers looking at metabolic health over the next 4 years. That's the target. And
that is absolutely fantastic. Sir, I could listen to you all day, but we've covered so much this morning. We could probably do about 3 different podcasts on this. Really want to get more about the funding area and what that could do, because that's where I see a sustainable change with multiple stakeholders, which is critically important to reframe what health actually means. But Neill, how do people contact you? Because you are a wealth of knowledge.
Yeah, so the best is through my LinkedIn page. So it's Neill Friedman, and for some very strange reason, you need to check my parents about. It's Neill with two L's. Neill, and Friedman is Friedman. So it's Friedman, if you put it that way, from the German spelling. So that's the best place to contact me. And the BERG F also has a LinkedIn page, so you can just look at the BERG F. So BERG space capital F. Where you can find out a bit more about the BERG F. And that's the best place to get hold of me. And then besides obviously always looking for the funding, if people want, I'm very happy to work with people in terms of, especially in corporates, in terms of workshops and seminars and presentations, in terms of trying to help take some of that toxicity in the environment. I don't do that I don't actively search out that work because my time is very precious to me. But certainly when I get invited into corporate, I'm very happy to come and talk on the subject, particularly if the end point of that is that the corporate is prepared to make a sponsorship towards the BERG F and to future science.
Neill, on behalf of everybody here in the heart of Glasgow and all involved with metabolic well-being without the BS, you've covered so many ranges of conversation. I'm looking forward to getting this out on the airwaves. But a massive thank you for the precious gift that you've given today of your time, your wisdom, a little bit of wit, and more importantly, your presence, my friend.
Martin, thanks very much. Thanks for having me. And I don't know if your guests say this enough back to you, but the exact same for having this podcast and for putting it out and sharing all the messaging that you do. I think we all owe you a big debt of gratitude for doing that. And certainly I appreciate that.
Thank you, sir.